All right, let's just do it. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. I am Scott Badwa Brennan. I'm the director of the NYU Center on Technology Policy, and I'm really excited to have a conversation today about the RAISE Act, which the New York legislature just passed last month and may or may not be signed into law by Governor Hochul in the next week or so. This law, if passed, would be a unique new approach, at least in the US, to the regulation of frontier AI models. And we have this amazing group of folks together to discuss the bill. And I'll just say really quickly, I want to divide our conversation into three kind of main parts. First, I want to focus on what the bill actually does or would do if it's enacted. Second, I want to zoom out a little bit to situate the bill in the context of what other states and the federal government are doing or trying to do as it concerns AI regulation and regulation of frontier models. We have some interesting news out of California today, yesterday to sort of talk about. And then finally, and maybe the most importantly, I want to talk about what the impact of the bill may have in the state and beyond. And I'm particularly interested in three areas: AI safety, AI innovation, and competition. We'll also leave some time at the end for audience Q&A, but please feel free to throw questions up into the chat or the Q&A feature. I'll try to keep an eye on it as we go, but no promises. All right, so enough. Let me introduce our amazing panel. So we are so excited to welcome Assemblymember Alex Boris of the New York State Assembly and sponsor of the RAISE Act, Senator Andrew Granardis of the New York State Senate and also sponsor of the RAISE Act, Austin Jenkins, Crackerjack staff reporter at Pluribus News and not a sponsor of the RAISE Act, Alvaro Maragnon, sorry for that, privacy policy manager at Meta, and finally Serena Aduro, privacy manager at Data and Society. All right, so I want to start with Senator Granardis and Assemblymember Boris. Let's talk about what the bill actually does. So Assemblymember Boris, let's start with you. We're going to get into the weeds in a minute, but just give me the 1 to 2 sentence kind of elevator pitch for the bill. What does it do?
Well, first of all, thanks for gathering this group together and excited to have this conversation. This bill, which only applies to the largest AI developers, largely holds them to less than they have already publicly committed to doing in order to keep everyone in the city, state, country, world safe from some pretty extreme risks, such as the creation of bioweapons or other crimes that can be committed that they themselves have said are real concerns they are looking out for.
Okay, Senator, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, no, I would describe it using an analogy. Like we are requiring seatbelts and airbags in the installation of Hummers that can travel as fast as Lamborghinis, right? That's basically what we are trying to do. And I think if you ask anyone, but particularly ask anyone in the tech world, any of these CEOs or any of these AI scientists, would they put their kids in a car without a seatbelt today? Absolutely not, because they know that it's a common sense guardrail to protect against a worst case inevitability, which is a crash, right? We're trying to just require the same types of guardrails here to say that we want this, we know this technology is here, we know the automobile is here to stay, newsflash, right? We know AI is here to stay, newsflash. We should have seatbelts on the cars. We should have guardrails around this technology. Simple as that.
All right, so let's get into the weeds. I want to talk about what those guardrails specifically are. So what is the final version? I know the bill has been through some amendments. What does the final vision of the bill require of frontier model developers? And whoever wants to take this can, or I can. Okay, Senator, do you want to?
Referring to me. So basically, the bill requires just a couple of really basic things, and I'll let Alex kind of fill in some of the details. Number one, it requires companies that are developing these frontier models, again, the very small set of companies at that computational level, to create and share safety and security protocols before they deploy these models publicly. It also requires them not to deploy models that have demonstrated an unreasonable risk of a critical harm, and we define that in the bill as certain thresholds. It requires them to report safety incidents, so like there is some transparency around as these models are being trained and tested and developed. Like, hey, something didn't work right here. Hey, something didn't meet our expectations here. There's an orange flag of concern. There's a red flag of concern, and then it requires you to complete an annual kind of assessment against those safety plans. That's really it. That's at its core what this bill does, and why I think of it really as guardrails and not really regulation in that respect. I'll let Alex fill in any details I may have missed.
No, all the details were there. I'll be the analogy guy for this round. This is like the tobacco companies knowing that cigarettes cause cancer, but denying it publicly and still releasing their products, or the oil companies knowing that their products cause climate change, but denying it publicly and still releasing it. This is saying, you large tech companies, you design your own safety protocol ahead of time when you're not trying to make your next quarterly goal, when you're not worried about the heat of the race. Define what safety would be, and then if your models fail your own tests, we want to know about it.
Okay, yeah, I think this is a good time to jump ahead a little bit. Like, you're focused on critical harms here. What are you talking about, right?
So a critical harm is defined in the bill as causing 100 deaths or $1 billion in damages by one of two routes: either aiding in the development of a chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapon, or committing a crime under the penal law with no meaningful human interaction. This is not every risk in AI. It's not the most immediate risks in AI. It's not the most common risks in AI. There's legislation and activity that both the Senator and I have sponsored separately, and our colleagues have done, that focus on all of those really, really pertinent issues. This is dealing with just the subset of very extreme risks. And I'll add in, for critical harm, there's also defenses in the bill that the model needs to have been a material cause of that harm, and that it has to be foreseeable, and that there were some action you could have taken that would have prevented it. It is an extremely limited set of risks that we're addressing.
Yeah. So are there specific examples of frontier model developers engaging in activity that would now be prohibited under the act?
Well, I don't know that there's the transparency that we would be able to answer that question, but largely this isn't saying that every company is behaving badly. What this is saying is almost every company has signed a document that says they're going to do all of this and more, but that is not written into law anywhere. And what the companies have said publicly as well is that if they see their competitors walking back those commitments, that might change the way they behave. And we've seen recently more models being released without the safety cards that were there before, without the third-party audits that were promised. And so this is responding to that call and putting the baseline so that we ensure the continued good behavior.
Great. So in addition to, well, we talked about critical harms, but who exactly is covered? So how do you define frontier model developers, and what counts as a covered platform here?
You want me to go for that, Alex?
Yeah, go for it.
So the bill, we say the bill only applies to frontier models, and that's those models that are trained using a greater than 10 to the 26th degree computational power, with a compute cost of more than $100 million. And large developers. These are generative AI developers that have trained at least one frontier model and have spent over $100 million in the aggregate training these frontier models, with exemptions for universities that are using these models purely for academic research. That's really who we are talking to. We really think that this bill only applies to, a handful of the largest AI labs on the planet, because it specifies that they have to have spent $100 million in total training frontier models. And so there's only, I don't know, 8, 10, maybe 11 labs right now that approach that threshold. So we're not talking about the world here. We're talking about a very small number of the largest actors who are operating in this space.
But
Yeah.
there's another class of companies that's included here, right? Like it's not just on the developers of the original model, but
Yeah. So, well,
that's
so
something
it
we've already
is.
seen.
There's two criteria. There's the large developer, as the senator said, where you have to spend $100 million in training. That is its own category. If you have not spent $100 million on compute on the final training run of your models, this bill does not apply to you. Full stop. Second of all, there's the definition of a frontier model, right? You need to have both of those things. And a frontier model can either be, as the senator said, 10 to the 26 flops and $100 million in training, or a model created via the specific process of knowledge distillation, and for which you spend $5 million of that. And that knowledge distillation needs to be created based on a model that is itself a frontier model, which, is taking into account everyone, but is certainly somewhat inspired by what we saw in DeepSeek, where we saw them use knowledge distillation, spend over $5 million off of O1. Now, O1 wasn't a frontier model, so DeepSeek that is in everyone's mind wouldn't be as well, but it's to capture those future aspects. But the really important point here, and something that I think some of the critics of the bill have either not understood or willfully not understood, is even if you use knowledge distillation, you need to, as a company overall, have spent $100 million on the final training run of compute costs of models. So no startup that's spending 5 million or 10 million or 75 million is going to be covered, regardless of how they act in this way.
Oliver, I'd like to bring you in here. We're going to talk about the sort of like open source debate, or how open source models or open weight models kind of fit in here. I just wonder if you could speak really quickly to your sense of how Llama fits in, and how other developers training based on Llama models might or might not be covered.
Thank you. Thank you again for the opportunity and to discuss this important issue space. So to begin on open source, as many know here, Meta is a pioneer in this space. We believe that open source is a key to unlocking innovation and is an important consideration in any framework around AI. The critiques and concerns here with this scoping around how broad this would expand and impact the larger ecosystem comes down to the proposed thresholds, the compute costs, and the large developer threshold. We have general concerns regarding how the risks are being evaluated and framed here. There's deficiencies around compute costs. There's known deficiencies. A working group report out of California that critiqued this for failing to address the aspect of model capabilities, such as the model's data and its architectural novel techniques. The large developer threshold is also under-inclusive. As the sponsor just mentioned, it would now capture foreign-based firms. And this would cause a great deal of concern from us for the larger ecosystem. It would give boost to foreign firms and, in our opinion, disproportionately impact and impede US AI developers who are doing and leading in the space. And the knowledge distillation part is really key for us because we openly release models that go through our vetting process. And again, this is not for general AI models, but specifically for a frontier, this would capture a wide range and pretty much create a ceiling on AI innovation. It would subject these US firms to these obligations around unreasonable risks of vague harms downstream. And we understand they're tailored towards CBRN and the specific subset of risks. But the reality is the evaluation maturity of these benchmarks aren't there yet. And it would pose the entire burden on a subset of developers, just regarding downstream developers or deployers.
Yeah, well, okay, so we'll get more into the like impact on innovation, and how it may or may not impact it, but I really want to focus on this question of, would this bill cover developers who take an existing Llama model and fine tune it and then deploy it in the world? Let's say that they spend $5 million to fine tune existing Llama model and then deploy it. Would they be covered?
Only if they are also spending $100 million total on training frontier models.
Okay. So, I mean, presumably they're not, right? Like, I mean, the reason that they would be fine tuning, I assume, like an open weight model is because they don't have the capacity. Okay. So that's really good clarification, because I mean, I'll be honest, I wasn't sure I understood that going into this. So that's good. That's great to have that clarification. What I said, yeah, Alvaro, you want to jump in?
Yeah. Hey, thank you for that. I just appreciate. So the question is whether it would have to first be determined that llama is a frontier model, and based on the definition,
Okay.
there anything from there will be distilled. And it goes back to the question around how do you define frontier? And the proposed thresholds are insufficient in our opinion. As it's noted, DeepSeek's R1 model would be out of scope. China's A1 and we 34B model will be out of scope. A lot of foreign-based, Saudi-based firms models will be out of scope. So
But would llama be in scope?
if it hit the threshold, if our llama model hit the threshold, yes. If it hit, but it depends on the actual text and language once it's fully implemented.
But as it's like the current version, as far as we know, the 10 to the 26 flops and $100 million, that would include llama.
Correct. And yeah.
Okay.
And it would expose us to liability, anyone who distills off of that as well.
Okay. Great. So what is the so to like keep harping on this point, but I think it's actually really important. So what is the rationale for excluding smaller labs or developers under this threshold? Right, if we're focused on critical harms, like couldn't smaller labs create really worrying sort of risks here? So why exclude anything under this threshold?
Absolutely. They could pose a risk. We were really focused on the most extreme risks and the most likely to provide those risks. And it's not a linear comparison. It's not deterministic, but the larger models, the most advanced models, are generally the ones that have the best capabilities and therefore generally the ones that pose the largest risks. And so that's where we tried to, in being very humble with this legislation, focus on it. I'm happy to hear some of our critics recognize that. But then many of the same people are putting out talking points about how this is a ceiling on AI development and a limit on AI development, and simultaneously saying it's under-inclusive in what it's covering. And so I think we were very limited, very targeted, very specific. There's definitely room to expand it. And anyone who talks to us and says, hey, we think there's additional risk to be covered, I don't want to speak for the senator, but I'm pretty confident saying we'd both say we agree. But we're starting in a humble place that's very much in line with what the companies themselves have already promised.
All right. I want to move ahead and expand our aperture a little bit and talk more about how this bill fits into what else is going on. But I'm just going to mark. I want to come back if we have time at the end and talk a little bit more about enforcement, because I think this is something that's often sort of overlooked, but is a really important sort of aspect here. But Austin, I want to turn to you. Can you just give us some context here? What is the sort of 40,000-foot view of how this bill fits into the larger landscape of state AI regulation at this moment?
Yeah, sure. So we know that, especially in the absence of federal or congressional action, state legislators are leaning into AI regulation, just as they've been leaning into data privacy protections and youth online safety. Someone described, maybe somebody on this panel at one time described, state legislatures as sort of a shadow Congress doing, the work of state legislatures, but also doing work that you would typically expect would be happening at the federal level. But since it's not, state legislators are stepping into this. This safety approach to AI is a subset, maybe of a subset of AI, a plethora of AI bills that are being introduced and debated in state houses around the country. We were very focused last year on comprehensive AI regulation, focused in particular on algorithmic discrimination. We were also last year focused on SB 1047 out of California, which was their frontier model safety bill that got a ton of coverage, brought everybody out of the woodwork, and was ultimately vetoed by the governor. And so what I just think is fascinating about the RAISE Act passing is it's like a game of ping pong, right? The governor in California vetoes the safety bill last year. This ping pongs to New York. These two legislators take this on, try to learn from New York, narrow the scope, arguably, get it passed. We'll now see what the governor does. Meanwhile, as of today, Senator Wiener in California, who had that safety bill, is back with his own version that he's sort of beefing up and adding some elements to along these same lines. There's some new reporting requirements that he's just added to his sort of placeholder bill. So California and New York are the two states to watch when it comes to AI safety. And I think Senator Guinardes said it to me a couple of weeks ago, that he really sees these two states as being in a position to set the national standard here.
Yeah, so I'd love to follow up on that. Like maybe y'all could talk about how 1047 did sort of inform the genesis of this bill.
Yeah,
Senator,
sure.
you wanna-
I'll jump in there, and Austin's right. That's exactly what I said when we spoke about this. We learned a lot, I think, from 1047, which in many respects was much more sweeping. It was kind of the first step into this breach, and obviously it was unsuccessful ultimately, but it really informed how we decided to move here. First of all, we don't include model derivatives like 1047 did. We do cover knowledge distillation, as Alex talked about, but that's a very different training process than the derivative model. We don't cover fine tuning, as we kind of alluded to a short while ago. We don't create new government agencies or regulatory bodies. We do enforcement through the Attorney General's office, through its Bureau of Internet and Technology, which over the last couple of years, the legislature in New York has beefed up, both from a mandate perspective as well as a resource perspective, to develop the proper expertise to wade into some of these questions. We don't require kill switches, right? We don't. This is not like the Dr. Strangelove like Doomsday Machine where you got to pull the plug type of thing. We're not requiring that as 1047 did, and really notably, and this was an area of significant debate as we were trying to wrap the bill up and get over the finish line. The question of third-party audits, which 1047 did include. We originally included in our proposal. And ultimately, as we amended it to get it over the finish line, ended up dropping that piece from it, recognizing that there were still some questions about how that would be able to operate at this stage in the industry's development. And so, what I think that leaves us with is a much simpler, much more streamlined bill that still requires the safety plan, still requires the reporting of critical harms, and that gives us a foundation to build on in the years ahead. And really notably, as someone who is not, unlike my colleague here, who is a computer scientist and really is spent a career, steeped in a lot of this stuff. For me, what I think is notable is that where we ended up with the RAISE Act, by and large, not one-to-one match, but by and large, kind of aligns with what the California Commission even recommended as key considerations for the regulation of these frontier models. And that report just came out a couple of weeks ago, as we all know. So I think it shows that we were on the right mark with learning the lessons we did from 1047 and trying to build a foundation for the path forward.
The other kind of interesting contextual point here, I think, is the moratorium. And I'll just say, as a bit of an outsider here, it definitely seemed like the bill got a bit of a boost once the moratorium was at least passed the House. Serena, I'd like to jump to you. Maybe you could weigh in here on where we stand on where the moratorium stands and how you see it fitting into this conversation about frontier models.
Thank you. Glad to be here in this conversation. Yeah, it's interesting with the moratorium because obviously it was ultimately stripped and didn't pass in the big beautiful bill. But there's definitely been a lot of reporting that it will come back in some form, that it's not an idea that's over with, which is pretty dangerous in my opinion. So it is an interesting moment because states are acting right now as New York is with the RAISE Act and other acts, but they also have over the past few years. A lot has been passed, a lot of momentum has been made. And especially on the federal level, it would be great, obviously, if we got algorithmic accountability legislation, but I do worry about how that would actually encompass all the harms that we really care about. Maybe it would address child safety or artist protection, but in the current political environment, not sure that would really touch algorithmic discrimination or the whole kind of host of harms that we really need to have a federal bill that's really expansive enough to protect people from the many types of algorithmic harms that they are, let alone with the frontier models. They might address that, but again, not sure how they do it in a really sweeping way. So I think after having the idea of the moratorium really take hold, which again, I think a lot of people didn't think it would or didn't know it would, or it kind of came out of nowhere in many ways. I hope it's kind of a big push for, people on the state level and also federally for people to really care about state legislation and to push it forward, especially because, in the States, we know our constituents and like the issues that need to be addressed. So that's what I'm hoping for. And I also think the interesting thing with the moratorium too is even on the Republican side, when it was brought up, obviously there's not just complete consensus or that it should be done because again, different states represent their constituents and they have that right to do that. It's not just that, Democratic states have been passing protections and others haven't. Like it's been a whole host, and it's actually been like Texas has done interesting stuff in legislation that people might not expect. So I'm hoping that that patchwork and in general interests in a pretty bipartisan way in AI makes it so the moratorium doesn't stick, but definitely, like I said, ultimately wasn't passed, but the idea isn't dead.
Yeah, well, I'd love the senator and the assembly member to follow up on the relation between the sort of the bill and the moratorium. Like, how are you thinking about the moratorium right now?
I think it's as ridiculous to ask for states to have a moratorium on AI regulation as it is to ask for a moratorium on AI development. I honestly believe there should be a federal bill addressing so many of these issues. I support any Congress member or senator that wants to do that. I'm happy to chat about all of those things. I'm sure there are times, but I can't think of a time where Congress has said, we're not going to do our job, but we are going to prevent you as the states from doing it as well. The state's traditional role is the laboratories of democracy. We can move quicker. We can try different things. As Serena just said, we're often closer to our constituents and can understand their concerns even better. And so, especially on a topic that moves as quickly as AI, the states have a really important role to play in trying those new things and in putting things forward. And we're not going to get it right every time. But ultimately, you hope that the federal government does eventually take action, and we'd really support that. What we don't support is sticking our heads in the sand and saying we're going to completely remove any ability to shape this technology in the way that's best for our cities, states, and our country.
Great.
Yeah, I'll just
Oh,
if I can
go
just
for it.
add in there, the takeaway for me and the lesson for me is where we see Congress's failure to act in the social media context, right? And that it's really two fronts. Number one, this technology is evolving so rapidly. To expect members of Congress to understand the intricacies of AI development and policy and regulation, to be able to come up with an appropriate framework, I think is really just like it's fanciful. I mean, do you remember that there was that social media hearing 2, 3 years ago where U.S. senators were asking, social media, I think it was Mark Zuckerberg, like, how does your company operate? How do you send a tweet? What's a friend request? Like really basic stuff that members of Congress, U.S. senators that we all voted for, didn't know what social media was. Like to expect them to figure out a critical harm from an AI frontier model when they can't figure out how to send a tweet is really crazy. And in that same vein, I came to this fight after taking on some social media legislation in the past years, and I would love federal social media legislation just as much as I would love federal AI legislation. The last time Congress acted to protect kids on the internet was in 1998. I was 13. We were still getting America Online discs mailed to us at home every week, promising us 30 free hours of online access. Social media wasn't even invented. By the time Congress gets its act together, it'll be 50 years and then it'll be far too late, which is why I think states have not only an opportunity, but an obligation to act, and why that moratorium was just so boneheaded.
I mean, I definitely take your point that like Congress has been incredibly select. We did see the Take It Down Act, which a tiny, a small sort of like step in the right direction. I mean, there continues to be a great deal of interest in federal Congress for doing not only AI regulation but about kids, social media. Yeah, Alvaro, you raise your hand.
Yep, thank you. I just wanted to add, I think it'd be a really good point to discuss. I know both sponsors and others have talked in the past about parallels throughout history of the regulation and often have talked about seatbelts. But I think it's a really important point to address that we had that the standards and benchmarks that came out around automobile safety were the result of federal action collaboration with like academics and researchers, that understanding what the link and the causation between seatbelts and speed and vehicle and all these other architectural designs was important, but also the result of collaborations, with industry, researchers, and the government. And I think this comes back to the challenge we're facing here with this proposal, the lack of a federal anchor to kind of work with the laboratories of democracy to kind of address these issues, because we agree that these issues are pressing. But the absence of this regulation or absence of this framework does not mean that industries won't be leading this charge. In fact, we have already demonstrated a huge commitment, us with other peers, in working with research labs, working with academics, working with other institutions to advance this space and get benchmarks, and also, enhance transparency downstream and provide tools and mitigations. So I think it's really important. It should be a comprehensive and a public-partner partnership in this space to address these challenges, because as you say, the issues transcend between states, and also there's a lot of different equities here.
All right, I want to move on to our third period, our third set of topics around the impact, the potential impact of the bill. Because to me, this is like the heart of the matter, right? I'm a social scientist. I want to know what sort of impact it may or may not have. So let's start with AI safety. Serena, let's start with you. How do you see this bill? Do you see this bill making AI safer? How so? What role does civil society, where you come from, sort of play in the vision of this bill?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think for me, what's most intrigues me with the bill is actually having safety and security protocol requirements of like reports that are submitted and actually made public, and the opportunity to analyze them. I mean, to be honest, with the fines and the type of penalties, I'm not sure how much that'll like move the needle, or if they'll be scared of them per se, just being honest. But something that we do talk about at Data and Society a lot is the importance of reporting and like transparency for academics and researchers to analyze what's being reported, what's not, for civil society to also do that as well. That was something that was really interesting with NYC local laws 144s. Even after bias audits were required through the legislation, now researchers are analyzing them and kind of seeing what's being reported, what's not being reported, how is bias being accurately portrayed, how is it not, what data is needed. I would hope for that type of information to come forth from the legislation that could be interesting. I especially say that because I led Data Society's involvement in the NIST US AI Safety Institute Consortium. And so within that, we talked a lot about safety requirements. And I think the topic of safety is interesting, even compared to like responsible AI, because people often think of it as a very technical endeavor that does only, engage with issues of like CBRN or like harms around like death or things of that matter. I think something that'll be interesting to me with the safety and security protocol requirements and being able to analyze them is, since people often have a very technical conception of those issues, I'm interested in how the socio-technical approach can really like expand how that is conceived of, because I know that harms can be kind of missed when you don't have it. Also, even with the requirements in the bill around like 100 deaths, like that being a cause. I'm interested, especially because frontier models apply to so many applications that can be dangerous and like lead to death, how also a more nuanced analysis, even within the safety and security protocols, could actually give more analysis of what could actually lead to those deaths or like prevent them. I mean, I'm thinking of even with, if we say 100 deaths or people, that sounds very generic. But then when you think of living in the US, specific groups that are more likely to receive harm, children, women, people of color, through hate crimes or other things, how do you analyze safety and security from those type of mechanisms to have a more accurate analysis of who could be harmed, and what protocols do we do to analyze that? From my experience being in AI safety conversations, I worry that oftentimes people's approach to analyzing harm doesn't really get at that. And so I am interested of, could at least the reporting provide the opportunity to like learn more or analyze more, or even just offer a critique to then push that forward. Like Alex Boris said, it's kind of a floor. But yeah, it's missing, so it's worrisome to me. But I hope that analysis and that transparency could maybe help push it forward.
I mean, I couldn't agree more that, as a researcher, I'm always really excited to see, more stuff for me to jump into to better understand what's going on. But for me, for saying, I mean, sort of the way you're describing it is that there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of difficulty in actually making these assessments about what constitute actual critical risk. That's great for researchers to like have a lot to like chew on. But here there's a requirement that frontier model developers actually identify the risks that their models actually pose. And if they don't accurately identify them, there's real consequences. So how do y'all yeah, Alvaro, you just raised your hand, but I was going to ask, like, well, so how are y'all thinking about like that challenge of actually accurately identifying what are the safety risks at play? Yeah, Alvaro, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for the great discussion around safety. I think the ultimate challenge comes down is what the act requires is preventing certain outcomes. And the ultimate challenge is that the sole commitments, which a lot of our peer companies have signed into, was aimed at providing transparency and describing how you think about these catastrophic outcomes and what mitigations, assessments, and evaluations you put in place to prevent them. The reality is the AI ecosystem is broad. There are a lot of downstream actors. There's a lot of different contextual things you must consider. So when we developed our Frontier AI framework and assess these obligations, we work with researchers, we work with other groups to assess how deployment context matters here. How does someone taking this model downstream, using it with, let's say, their expertise in CBRN, account for this risk? And how do you address other mitigations? It could be resource restrictions. And I think my main concern here with this is that the bill does not provide any exceptions for in-house research labs. And this does really threaten open source. Open source in other contexts and other domains throughout history has shown to advance security, whether it be internet or cybersecurity. Open source allows transparency in these measures. And I know we've spoken about it briefly, but the working group report that came out of Governor Newsom's veto of SB 1047 also highlighted the fact that open source already provides a great deal of transparency in this space, absent of any regulation. So I think the fact that in-house labs, which New York is home to a lot, the great scoping aspect of this that would apply to any AI developed in whole or in part in the state, could have a real chilling effect on those collaborations that are really useful, because as of now, the bill would only exempt accredited universities. So frontier developers could not partner with the other stakeholders to kind of address this and open it up and kind of get back that feedback loop, which is really important in this ecosystem.
Alvaro, if you don't mind, what actions or behaviors would Meta be less willing to do if the bill were passed? Like, what would it be chilling?
I'm just going to speak generally in the sense that it does not exempt research collaborations. So that's the main concern. We have FAIR. It's one of our most important partnerships that has worked with the state, especially New York. And this is our fundamental AI research group, and it's focused on advancing state AI. We could not release these models. We've worked in this space, given the liability that someone could take it and further fine-tune it downstream and create some type of threat that we didn't assess for or couldn't account for. I think that is the chilling effect for us. It's just the fact it would put all the liability upon us to assess all these downstream risks, and we can't engage in these collaborations. We can't engage in these partnerships given this threat of liability risk for downstream.
So what's interesting to me about that is that this bill, unlike the original 1047, which was focused on how you would allocate damages after an incident occurred, this bill explicitly creates no liability. It never had, but we had heard this concern, and so we added a line in the latest version that said, this does not create any private right of action. This does not create liability. It's about assessing the plan ahead of time. And so if any action that Meta is taking truly makes everyone safer, then there's nothing. First of all, there's no liability, period. But second of all, there's certainly nothing that is being discouraged in this bill. This bill is asking for plans and tests that would prevent 100 deaths or $1 billion in damages. As Serena pointed out, the fines are pretty puny compared to the resources of some of the large companies. I would have loved for them to be larger. I think if someone were to release a model, right, whether Meta or anyone else, and that model caused 100 deaths, like some crafty lawyer would figure out how to sue that company for a lot more than 10 or $30 million. And so I'm trying to understand, why is saying you have to have this plan ahead of time and these tests ahead of time going to change the behavior on what could lead to a truly catastrophic outcome?
I want to pick up on that question, but one clarifying point. Sorry, my understanding of the current text of the bill, and maybe it's been amended since then, it says a harm inflicted by an intervening human actor shall not be deemed to result from a developer's activities unless such activities were a substantial factor. There's a three-part test: substantial factor in bringing about the harm, the intervening human. Okay, whatever. I don't need to read it all. But to me, that says that in fact there is liability for the developer on how the model is then used by a deployer if it passes the sort of like three-part test.
It's saying
there's no private right of action, but certainly the AG could bring an enforcement or could bring an action, and also, well, anyway, yeah, sorry, I mean,
what it's saying is the plan needs to account for that. It is not saying liability. The only enforcement in the bill is the AG bringing a suit for up to 10 million for a first or up to 30 million for a second violation for violations of the act itself. Right. And so that means not having the plan, not disclosing it, not having that plan up to snuff. Whether you end up actually having an incident afterwards is something that's already handled by background liability. I assume that the argument being made by tech is not, if we release a model that kills 100 people, we are not liable right now. I think that's handled by product liability and other aspects that are out there. This is not shifting that burden of proof. This is saying you need to take actions ahead of time before you deploy it.
So if I could just jump in, I think the main missing point here with the concern is that the discretion from the AG would open up the design aspects or what the development aspect and to define what unreasonable risk is. The bill constantly describes what this unreasonable risk is, and it doesn't really provide any guidance or clarification of what this means in practice around how to build your compliance posture or to address this downstream. And as you said, it's impossible to assess in an open source context how any actor may take this downstream and combine it with any existing technologies to create this type of harm. Misuse, we do anticipate and do assess for downstream risks, but it's impossible to capture everything. Full prevention is just simply not possible.
The last bit, I 100% agree. You already look downstream. 100% prevention is possible, which is why we set the standard at 100 deaths, $1 billion in damage in these very restrictive ways. We're not looking for no harms from any model. We're looking for making sure the most extreme harms are accounted for.
That's great. So I do want to go back to Assemblymember Boris, your question about how, were the act to be implemented, it would change the behavior of different sort of actors, including some of these, Alvaro, what you mentioned, these in-house research labs. I think that is a sort of key question here to understand the potential impact. So I don't know who wants to jump in here, but let's start there. Yeah, Alvaro, maybe we'll come to you. How would the act? So you said you said that like it might prevent these sort of research partnerships or in-house research being done, but why is that exactly? Like, say more about that.
Yep. Thank you. So the bill's scoping would apply to any base, I think for exact definite language, but it says it would apply to any frontier model that's developed whole and part in the state. And the reality is New York currently is home to a very rich AI ecosystem. And based on from our understanding, it has over 40,000 AI adjacent jobs. It is home to a robust existing infrastructure for AI labs. And the reality is it's through these partnerships, through our fair and other collaborations where breakthroughs do happen. You know, Google's transformer that led to the breakthrough in LLMs came out of an in-house lab. A lot of the mitigations and safety responses from our old models came out of in-house labs and work in these partnerships. And we think this is a huge concern that isn't addressed by this bill, given that it's only scoped to accredited universities. So the fact that there is potential liability for this framework if these models are released. The bill does not differentiate between unreleased or released weights. So given this access to these partnerships, through these collaborations, you could face liability if it gets exposed through that type of, through this collaboration. Again, this scoping could also apply as you're developing, because as a large developer, you already be hit with this label and be subject to the potential requirements around transparency requirements and AG reporting. But the concern is we couldn't partner with anyone downstream. We couldn't partner with startups. We couldn't partner with more specialized civil society groups, academic institutions, nonprofits. I think that's the concern from us. The chilling effect of potential liability from this is what drives us.
If I can just clarify, you're worried about increased liability for Meta, or you think this would create liability for those that you would partner in a way that they would no longer want to partner with you?
I think it'd be for the larger ecosystem. I think there's some lack of clarity around some of the vagueness of the terms that we previously identified. What is a catastrophic harm and how to assess that downstream, what it means to be unreasonable, or what determination means an increased risk of an unreasonable risk of harm. I think these types of chilling effects could drive away developers from this ecosystem. And I think the main concern from us is the fact that foreign-based firms could already be releasing these open source models. We know China's based firms will be releasing it. So while the US companies who are captured under a large developer label would be restricted, making sure their existing implementations account for the risks outlined in here, while foreign-based firms are free to release their models and act on government.
Scott, I've spoken a lot, but if we can
Go
talk
for
about foreign versus, thank you. I really appreciate that point about kind of foreign companies versus the US here. And the way that the senator and I have written the RAISE Act, it applies to anyone who is deploying the model in New York. And insofar as a future version of DeepSeek this would apply to, and they are in the App Store and available to New Yorkers, DeepSeek would have to file safety plans. DeepSeek would be subject to all of this. As I understand it, and I would turn to Austin and Serena and others that have a more nationwide view, the RAISE Act is the only pending piece of legislation that would apply safety standards to foreign companies that right now don't have to do it. And so it's tough to hear, hey, we are opposed to a bill because it would impose differential standards and not have foreign companies subject to it, when the one bill that is imposing that is in fact applying to foreign companies insofar as they want access to the New York market, as the vast majority do.
Just a point of clarification, we're not opposed to frameworks in this space or advancing AI safety. We think there's a tremendous value in applying transparency across the ecosystem. We have concerns with the proposed thresholds, focusing solely on large developers, and how you define large developers we think is deficient. Based on publicly available disclosures around DeepSeek, they use significantly fewer flops in training R1 and is unlikely to approach the 100 million threshold. China's O1, A1, a model developed fewer than 200 employees, is reported to be as performant as Open1. So the concern is that by not focusing on model capabilities, certain models with equally exceeding capabilities of frontier models captured by large developers would be out of scope and not subject to this, because it's based on these publicly available metrics, which we have seen are have deficiencies, as the working group report has identified.
So y'all would be more in favor if it basically if it covered more ground, more companies, more models?
If it was consistent application focusing on a durable framework to assess how model capabilities advance throughout time, because as you said, it's hard to assess this to kind of catch both durability but also clarity around what the benchmarks are. And this is why we focus and really do endorse a capabilities-based outcome. Look at how models are looking through industry standards, benchmarking for certain areas of reasoning or other different considerations to help advance this ecosystem, because this would provide clarity to all developers. Because at the end of the day, we believe that if you are developing a frontier model, you should not be protected in any other way. It should be equal playing field, and it should be equal obligations. Because at the end of the day, if it's safety, it should apply to anyone developing these types of powerful models.
Do you have a sense of like what that would even look like capability-based benchmarks? Is there like a proposed set of capabilities that you think would be like sufficient?
The challenge is the lack of uniformity between each companies. That doesn't mean there isn't efforts in this space. Meta, ourselves, and other partners have already engaged in partnerships to kind of identify certain benchmark areas to kind of assess. But the issue between models is when you're assessing the capabilities of the models individually, they don't often fit one-to-one with other companies. So in that sense, they're not really objective, they're to be transferable. But we're arguing that this should provide a pathway to kind of build this infrastructure in this ecosystem, because right now it isn't mature enough. The lack of safety measurements and benchmarks to evaluate against isn't there. And as much as we would want, the science isn't mature enough. So we would appreciate a capabilities approach that kind of gives a broader scope and better clarity to kind of address future concerns as models advance and different metrics.
If I can just, chime in here, hearing all this back and forth, I think kind of reconfirms for me the approach that Alex and I took. You do not want a state legislature or a national legislature to mandate some Rube Goldberg type of regulation on the development of these technologies. There is so much fluidity and flexibility in how they operate, how they're structured, what their capabilities are. We just heard there's not a one-to-one apples-to-apples comparison from company A to company B. You don't want Andrew Gennardis writing a regulatory scheme. You want people like us to say, hey, companies, you the ones that have amassed the greatest wealth of brain power in the world to develop this technology, you know what is right and what is not right in these cases. You know what is or should know what is unreasonable or unreasonable. We are trusting you as the kind of the gatekeepers of humanity here to just put in place a system to say, hey, yellow flag, hey, orange flag, and then we trust you to report it to us. Because if we take a more prescriptive approach, which is where it sounds like, I know we didn't say it, but it sounds like that's ultimately where, when you start thinking about a more sophisticated landscape and environment, it invites a more sophisticated regulatory approach. And you don't want, I think you don't want that from a tech perspective. People like me, maybe Alex, because he's more of a computer scientist than I am, but you don't want people in our shoes trying to put a system in place over this technology that's truly going to choke innovation, that's truly going to restrict the ability of things to operate, that's not going to understand a business model or anything like that, and you're going to end up with a much worse outcome from a business and an industry perspective than you do with an approach like ours that says, hey, you guys who are developing this, you guys who are already saying we should have protections, we should have regulations. Most of the major companies have sounded the alarm on this already, even in recent weeks and months. We are trusting you to come up with a system of a safety plan to mitigate the risks as you see them. Because the alternative is having us do it, and that's the worst possible outcome you could ever imagine. And so I think that this conversation, certainly for me as a legislator, just validates the approach we've taken and why I think it's a smart approach rather than trying to be overly prescriptive at a time when that's going to do more harm than good.
Right. We have only a few minutes left, so I'm just going to say, anyone in the audience, please, we'll sort of open it up for Q&A. We'll continue on with the conversation, but please, if you have any questions, throw them in the chat, and we'll make sure that they get addressed. I do want to make sure that we have some time to talk about. So one of the big critiques of this sort of legislation is that it impedes innovation. In particular, disadvantages smaller companies as opposed to larger ones. So I'll just open up in general to the floor, whoever wants to take this. How do you, the sponsors, how do you see this criticism? For the others, what are your concerns about the impact on innovation in the space here?
I'll just say a quick anecdote here. Early on in the process, a tech association came up to Albany to lobby against the bill, and they wanted to meet with me. And their argument was, this is going to decimate startups. This is going to kill all startups using AI. This is going to completely destroy the ecosystem in New York. And they brought a consortium of startups to come meet with me. And I went one by one around the room, and I asked them all what they did. One company used AI to make more efficient solar panels. Another company was using AI to help draft legal, commercial leases for contracts and stuff. Not a single startup in the New York ecosystem that they brought up, that the Tech Association brought to Albany to lobby and speak about the harms of this bill, would fall anywhere within the scope of this bill. And frankly, when I see that type of advocacy directed at me, it makes me not want to trust or believe anything that comes out of the tech industry in terms of their concerns over any type of public policy question, because it's laughably and demonstrably false. Don't send a solar panel installer to tell me that the RAISE Act is going to stop their business from coming off the ground. Like their Brooklyn-based solar company that uses AI is going to now go bankrupt because we're proposing to protect humanity from catastrophic harms with a safety plan bill. So I think that some of these concerns are overly blown. I think there is space in this ecosystem where we want, to my earlier point about the last question, we want these technologies to continue to flourish and innovate with guardrails in place. We want further innovation here with seatbelts, with airbags. It should be noted that Detroit did not put airbags in cars by themselves because it wasn't in their best interest. They were forced to. It was not in their best financial decision, but they were forced to. We should have these guardrails in place to allow the innovation to flourish.
I take your point, but certainly there are compliance costs here and in other sorts of regulations, and it's not crazy to think that paperwork, red tape, risk of liability could actually have some sort of impact. I mean, not to belabor this point, but I mean, much of the argument around the big beautiful bill, right, is how red tape for Medicaid is going to result in individuals like losing access. Recognizing that just in the effort of having to file certain paperwork, you're gonna lose some. Maybe that's not a great sort of comparison, individuals on Medicaid versus like a startup company, but yeah, Serena, I see your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you. I always find the question of innovation and competition interesting in or innovation and kind of regulation and how that would actually slow it. A dichotomy that's very prevalent, I feel like, especially within the AI safety conversation. And it's one to me that I would like to see broken a bit, because something that's interesting to me is even within this conversation, we've talked about, like measuring versus capabilities, but also that's a bit underdeveloped when it comes to their application across like different companies. And that actually mirrors, I was pulling up, the House Energy and Commerce Committee put out a letter December 14th, 2023, actually addressed to the NIST AI Safety Institute around the development of AI safety principles, because they talked about the fact that a lot of AI safety efforts are actually, again, underdeveloped. They talked about how a lot of studies from companies are self-referential. And so the science of a lot of these principles are actually not like where they should be, though there is a wide swath of research that definitely talks about AI harms and things that could be helped to prevent it. But overall, it is underdeveloped. And so when we talk about like innovating, I think there's a lot of money in AI. There's a lot of interest in AI being rapidly developed without truly undergirding like the scientific integrity needed to make sure that these systems work really well in different applications for the public. And so to me, I don't think that having, especially regulations like this, which isn't like too like stringent anyway, is actually going to stop innovation. I think it will maybe, and I still kind of doubt it, stop rapid development. But when it comes to true innovation that's scientifically undergirded through empirical research and data, I don't see it as a threat to that. And if anything, I think part of what we're missing is because models are able to be developed and then the guardrails and actual places of inquiry to assess like its impacts on people are not pursued. And I think that's for a lot of reasons. I think that's some disciplinary bias with, within STEM, et cetera. So yeah, I think it's a dichotomy that isn't super helpful, and I think keeps us from actually answering the scientific questions that could lead to good innovation, instead just focusing on wanting rapid development.
Yeah, I'm going to agree entirely with Serena and actually disagree with something that Andrew said, where he said, don't trust tech here, or he doesn't trust tech. I would say, actually listen to them on this point. We've heard all of the large developers say that they feel targeted and they want it applying to more people. That suggests we did a pretty good job of protecting startups and protecting smaller companies. And I would also say we got a memo of opposition from a group speaking for big tech that said that it would cost Google and Meta one full-time employee to comply with the bill. One. And that's the group that's opposing the bill, that has every incentive to say it's a huge amount of paperwork. I think when you're spending $100 million on compute for models, one person for compliance is not too much to ask.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. So we can, that's, I think, a good place to leave it. But I just want to thank you all so much for joining me today. This has been a really interesting conversation. I'll just say, we at the Center on Tech Policy, we do these sorts of conversations regularly. So keep an eye on our website and materials for future events. But so thank you all again.
Thank you.